The laughter did not fade all at once. It lingered in the air like dust that refused to settle, clinging to the edges of the room, to the rim of glasses, to the quiet corners where men pretended not to watch too closely. And Sheriff Dalton let it breathe just long enough before lifting one hand slightly, not to silence it, but to own it, to shape it, his fingers brushing the edge of Clara Whitmore's papers without picking them up, as if they carried no more weight than a stray receipt left behind by someone passing through. And when he finally looked down, it was with the kind of glance a man gives something already decided, already dismissed, his thumb flipping one page, then another, slow, careless, never quite focusing, the way a gambler shuffles cards he has no intention of playing. Clara did not move, not even when one of the men at the bar leaned closer to get a better look, not even when a chair scraped against the floor behind her. She simply stood there with her shoulders set, her chin level, her necklace catching a thin line of light, and somewhere near the back, Elias Carter shifted his weight just enough to ease the pressure on his boots, his eyes narrowing slightly, not at the sheriff, but at her, at the stillness she carried, the kind that did not come from stubbornness but from certainty, and that was something rare in a place like this. Sheriff Dalton let out a breath through his nose, then pushed the papers back across the wood with 2 fingers, not hard, not forceful, just enough to send them sliding an inch or 2, enough to make a point without raising his voice. And when he spoke, it was almost casual, like he was explaining something simple to someone who should have known better, his words drifting across the room in an easy tone that carried farther than a shout ever could. And a few men nodded before he even finished, already agreeing, already settled in their judgment. Clara listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his face. And when he was done, when the last trace of amusement settled into a quiet confidence, she reached forward and gathered the papers again, her fingers steady, aligning the edges with a care that seemed out of place in a room built on rough edges and quick decisions. And for a moment, it looked like she might say something more, like she might argue, might push back, might try to bend the room in her favor, but she did not. Instead, she gave a small nod, not to the sheriff, not to the men around him, but almost to herself, as if confirming something she had already known before she ever stepped inside. And then she turned, her boots carrying her back across the wooden floor, each step measured, unhurried, the door opening with a low creak that let in a strip of late sun and a breath of dry wind. And no one stopped her, no one called out, because in their minds, the matter had already been settled. But Elias Carter watched her go until the door closed again, until the light narrowed and disappeared. And even after the room returned to its usual rhythm, something in the air had shifted, something quiet and unspoken, like the feeling before a storm that no one could quite name. And he found himself glancing once more at the empty space where she had stood, not with doubt, but with the slow, steady sense that whatever had just been dismissed so easily was not finished, not by a long shot. Outside, the wind carried the dry scent of sage and dust across the open stretch of land, brushing against Clara Whitmore's face as she stepped down from the wooden porch and into the fading light, her boots pressing into the hard ground with a quiet certainty that did not match the dismissal she had just walked away from. And for a moment she paused, not to look back, but to listen, as if the silence behind her told her more than the laughter ever could. The town sat low against the horizon, a scattering of weathered buildings and tired fences, the kind of place that believed it had already decided what mattered and who did not. And Clara moved through it without hesitation, past the hitching posts, past the general store with its crooked sign, her pace steady, her expression unchanged, though her eyes carried something deeper now, something measured and deliberate, like a calculation already set in motion. At the edge of town, where the last structures gave way to open land, her ranch waited, modest but kept with care, a small house with a wide porch and a barn that had seen better seasons. And as she approached, the evening light stretched long shadows across the ground, turning every post and rail into lines that seemed to point somewhere just beyond sight. Inside the barn, the air was cooler, thick with the scent of hay and leather, and Clara moved with familiarity, setting her papers down on a rough work table worn smooth by years of use, her fingers resting on them for a brief second before she exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in quiet confirmation. She reached beneath the table and pulled out a narrow wooden box, its surface scratched and darkened with age, the kind of object that had been carried more than it had been stored. And when she opened it, the hinges gave a soft, tired creak that echoed in the stillness. Inside, wrapped in a faded cloth, lay something different from the papers she had shown in town, something older, heavier in meaning than in weight, and as she unwrapped it, the edges of a map revealed themselves, hand-drawn lines crossing worn parchment, ink faded but precise, each marking placed with intent rather than assumption. Clara laid it flat on the table, smoothing it carefully, her fingertips tracing along the borders, following paths that did not match the town's understanding of ownership, of control, of authority, and in the dim light, the details began to emerge, a river bend drawn slightly west of where it now ran, boundary lines marked before fences had ever been raised, and in one corner, a seal pressed into the paper, faint but unmistakable, a mark that did not belong to the sheriff or the town, but to something older, something recognized beyond the reach of local opinion. She stood there for a long moment, studying it not like a discovery, but like a memory, as if she had seen it before, as if she had carried it in her mind long before she ever unfolded it in her hands. And outside, the wind shifted, rattling the loose boards of the barn just enough to break the silence. Somewhere in the distance, a horse shifted in its stall, the soft sound grounding the moment, and Clara finally stepped back, her expression calm, resolved, as she folded the map with care, not hurried, not hesitant, and placed it back into the box. She closed the lid gently, the quiet click settling into the space like a decision made, and as she turned toward the open doorway, where the last light of day stretched thin across the land, there was no trace of doubt in her posture, only a steady readiness, the kind that did not need to announce itself, because it already knew what would come next. Morning came without ceremony, just a pale stretch of light crawling over the dry hills and slipping through the gaps in Clara Whitmore's barn, settling on the wooden box where it sat untouched on the table, and for a long moment nothing moved, not the air, not the dust, not even the quiet resolve that seemed to hold the place together, until the distant sound of hoofbeats broke the stillness, slow and measured, approaching from the direction of town. Clara was already awake, standing near the doorway with a tin cup of coffee gone cold in her hand, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if she had been expecting this exact rhythm, this exact timing, and when the rider finally came into view, the shape of him unmistakable even from a distance, she did not step forward to greet him, she did not call out, she simply waited. Elias Carter rode up without hurry, his horse stopping a few feet short of the barn, the animal shifting its weight, as if sensing the quiet tension in the air, and Elias remained in the saddle for a moment longer than necessary, studying her in the same way he had the night before, not with curiosity, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement that did not need words to be understood. He dismounted slowly, boots touching the ground with a soft thud, the dust rising just enough to catch the light, and for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them not as an absence, but as something deliberate, something chosen. Clara finally set the cup aside on the railing, her fingers brushing the wood briefly before she turned toward him fully, her posture straight, her expression calm, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same steady tone as before, not defensive, not uncertain, but grounded in something deeper than either of those things. Elias listened without interrupting, his eyes narrowing slightly as she spoke, not in doubt, but in thought. And when she finished, he glanced past her into the barn, his gaze settling on the table, on the box, on the place where something important had been laid out, and then carefully hidden again. He did not ask what was inside, not yet, but the question was there, unspoken, resting between them like a line drawn in the dirt that neither of them crossed too quickly. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint sound of town life waking up in the distance, a door opening, a voice calling out, the kind of ordinary noise that made everything seem settled, unchanged, as if nothing had happened the day before, as if nothing was about to change now. But Elias reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat slightly, his eyes returning to Clara with a quiet firmness that matched her own, and when he finally spoke, it was not to question her claim or her purpose, but to acknowledge something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with the sheriff or the town and everything to do with what she carried in that barn. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked inside, not to show him immediately, not to prove anything, but to let him follow if he chose, and after a brief pause, he did. The barn felt different with two people in it, the silence no longer empty but shared, and Clara moved to the table, her hand resting lightly on the wooden box before she opened it again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if the act itself carried weight. She unwrapped the cloth, revealing the map once more, and as the morning light reached across the surface, the faded lines seemed to sharpen, to stand out with a quiet clarity that had been missed in the dimness of night. Elias stepped closer, his eyes tracing the markings, the boundaries, the seal pressed into the corner, and for the first time, his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough to show that what lay before him was not just another claim, not just another piece of paper to be dismissed. He did not touch it, did not reach out, but the way he looked at it said everything, and Clara watched him in silence, not seeking approval, not asking for agreement, but waiting, steady and patient, as the truth settled in its own time. The barn held its silence like a held breath as Elias Carter stood over the map, his shadow stretching across the worn table, his eyes moving slowly along the faded ink lines as if he were reading something that had been written long before either of them had a say in it. And Clara Whitmore did not rush him, did not fill the space with explanation, because she understood that some truths needed to be seen before they could be spoken. The morning light shifted inch by inch, catching the edge of the parchment, revealing small details that would have been easy to miss, the slight tremor in a line that suggested it had been drawn by hand on uneven ground, the careful marking of a ridge that no longer appeared on newer maps, the kind of ridge that could only be known by someone who had walked it, measured it, lived it, and Elias finally exhaled, slow and quiet, as if something inside him had settled into place. He straightened just slightly, his gaze lifting from the map to Clara, and for a moment there was no question in his eyes, only recognition, the kind that did not come from trust alone, but from experience, from years of seeing claims rise and fall, from knowing the difference between something made to convince and something that simply was. Clara met his look without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly at her sides, and when she spoke, it was not to argue her case, not to defend what the sheriff had already dismissed, but to state something plain, something that carried its own weight without needing to be dressed in more words than necessary. Elias listened, his head tilting just enough to show he was following every detail, every quiet implication, and when she finished, he glanced back at the map once more, his eyes lingering on the seal pressed into the corner, that faint mark that tied the parchment to something older than the town's authority, something that could not be easily brushed aside with a laugh or a careless hand. Outside, the sound of the wind picked up again, rattling the loose edge of the barn door, a dry, steady rhythm that seemed to echo the tension building beneath the calm surface of the moment. And Elias reached out then, not to take the map, but to steady the edge of the table as if grounding himself before speaking. When he did, his voice was low, measured, carrying none of the easy dismissal Clara had faced the day before, only a quiet acknowledgement of what stood between them now, something that would not stay hidden for long. Clara listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving his, and there was a brief moment where the two of them stood in complete stillness, the kind that felt less like hesitation and more like agreement forming without needing to be named. Then she reached forward, folding the map again with the same careful precision, her fingers smoothing the edges as if preserving not just the paper, but the truth it carried, and placed it back into the wooden box. She closed the lid gently, the soft click settling into the space like a line drawn that could not be undone, and when she looked up again, there was no trace of uncertainty in her expression, only a quiet resolve that seemed stronger now than it had been the day before. Elias stepped back, giving the table space, giving her space, but not stepping away entirely, not turning toward the door, because something had shifted, something that tied him to what would come next whether he had planned for it or not. And as the light continued to climb higher, filling the barn with a steady glow, it became clear that what had been dismissed in a room full of laughter was not finished, not even close, and this time, it would not be ignored so easily. By midday, The sun had burned away the last of the morning cool, leaving the land stretched wide and unforgiving. Every fence post casting a sharp shadow that pointed nowhere and everywhere at once. And Clara Whitmore stood at the edge of her porch, watching the distant road that led back into town, her expression unchanged but her attention fixed, as if she could already see the shape of what was coming long before it arrived. Elias Carter had not left, not entirely, though he kept his distance now, leaning against the rail with one boot crossed over the other, his hat tilted low, his presence quiet but deliberate, like a man who had made a decision without announcing it, and the two of them shared the same silence without needing to fill it, because the weight of what lay ahead did not need words to make itself known. In the distance, a thin line of dust began to rise, faint at first, easy to mistake for wind alone, but it held its shape, steady, purposeful, and Clara's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in concern, but in recognition, as if this moment had already been accounted for somewhere in the careful lines of that folded map. The town did not stay still for long when something unsettled it, and word traveled faster than most men admitted, carried in low voices, in sideways glances, in the kind of quiet conversations that shaped decisions before they were ever spoken out loud, and it did not take much for a dismissed claim to turn into a question that needed answering. Elias shifted his weight again, his gaze following the same line of dust, and though he did not reach for anything, did not prepare in any visible way, there was a subtle change in how he stood, a readiness that came from experience rather than urgency, the kind that did not rush but did not hesitate either. Clara remained where she was, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture straight, her breathing steady, and when the figures within that distant haze began to take form, riders emerging one by one against the horizon, she did not step back, did not retreat into the shade of the house. She simply watched, her calm holding firm against the growing presence approaching her land. The first rider slowed as he neared the fence, the others following suit, their horses settling into place with quiet snorts and shifting hooves, and though no one spoke at first, the air carried a tension that was different from the day before, less certain, less dismissive, as if the laughter that had once filled the saloon no longer fit as easily in the space between them. Elias straightened slightly, his eyes moving from one rider to the next, not searching for trouble, but measuring intent, and Clara took a single step forward then, not to confront, not to challenge, but to meet whatever had come to her door on equal ground. The wind moved through the dry grass, a low whisper that filled the silence just enough to keep it from breaking too soon, and in that moment, with the sun high and the land stretched wide around them, it became clear that something had shifted beyond the walls of the town, something that could not be laughed away or pushed aside with a careless hand, and Clara Whitmore stood at the center of it, not as someone asking to be heard, but as someone who already knew she would be. The riders did not cross the fence right away. They lingered just beyond it, as if the thin line of weathered would carry more weight than it appeared, their horses shifting under them, heads low, ears turning toward every small sound. And Clara Whitmore stood her ground without stepping closer, without offering invitation or refusal, letting the moment settle into something that had to choose its own direction. The man at the front finally spoke, not loudly, not with the confidence that usually came easy in numbers, but with a tone that carried the weight of something unfinished, something brought here not for show, but for resolution, and Clara listened the same way she had listened the day before, steady, patient, her eyes never leaving his face, while Elias Carter remained just behind her, not at her side, not in front, but close enough that his presence was understood without being declared. The wind moved again, lifting a strand of Clara's hair, brushing it across her cheek before letting it fall back into place, and for a brief second, the stillness tightened, like a held breath shared by every man and animal in that space. The riders exchanged glances, subtle, uncertain, as if the purpose that had brought them here had shifted somewhere along the way, and one of them leaned slightly in his saddle, his gaze drifting toward the barn, toward the quiet structure that held more than it revealed, and that small movement did not go unnoticed. Clara turned her head just enough to follow that glance, then looked back at the man who had spoken, her expression unchanged, but something in her posture made it clear that she understood exactly what they had come for. even if they had not yet said it out loud. Elias adjusted his stance, the faint creak of leather barely audible, and his eyes moved across the group once more, reading them the way he had read the map, looking for what lay beneath what was being shown, and he found it in the hesitation, in the lack of certainty that hung over them like the dust still settling around their boots. The man at the front cleared his throat, his hand resting loosely on the reins, and when he spoke again, it was different this time, less about authority, more about asking without admitting it was a question, and Clara took a single step forward, closing just enough distance to shift the balance of the moment without breaking it. She did not answer right away. She let the silence stretch just long enough for them to feel it, to recognize that whatever came next would not be rushed, would not be shaped by the same easy dismissal they had seen in town. And then, slowly, she turned and began walking toward the barn. She did not look back to see if they would follow, did not gesture, did not explain, because she did not need to, and after a brief pause, one by one, the riders dismounted, boots hitting the ground in soft, uneven rhythms, the sound carrying across the dry earth like the beginning of something they had not planned for. Elias moved last, falling into step behind them, his presence quiet but watchful, and as they crossed the threshold into the barn, the light shifted, dimming just enough to change the way everything was seen, the table, the box, the space itself holding a quiet gravity that drew their attention forward. Clara reached the table and rested her hand on the wooden box, her fingers still, her posture steady, and for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, because something about the way she stood there made it clear that whatever lay inside was not just something to be looked at, but something that would change how this moment would be remembered, and none of them were quite ready for that, even if they had come all this way to find it. Clara Whitmore did not open the box right away. She let her hand rest on it as if feeling the weight of what lay inside, and the men gathered behind her shifted almost in unison, boots scraping softly against the packed dirt floor, their earlier certainty thinning into something quieter, something that listened instead of judged, while Elias Carter remained near the entrance, not blocking the light, not stepping fully into the shadow, standing exactly where both could meet, his gaze steady on Clara rather than the others, as if he already understood that whatever mattered here would come from her hands alone. The barn held the heat of the day in its beams, the scent of hay thick in the air, and outside, the wind pressed gently against the open doorway, carrying a low hum that never quite turned into sound, and for a long moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would not be answered by what came next. Clara finally moved, slow and deliberate, lifting the lid of the wooden box with care, the hinges giving that same quiet creak that seemed louder now with so many ears turned toward it, and as she unwrapped the cloth, each fold revealed itself like a step taken backward in time, until the map lay once again in her hands, worn but precise, fragile but certain. She did not hold it up, did not present it like proof to be defended. Instead she placed it flat on the table, smoothing it gently with her palm, turning it slightly so the light from the doorway fell across its surface just right, and that small motion, that simple adjustment, made all the difference. The lines sharpened, the markings came into view, the ridge, the river bend, the boundary that did not match what any of them had been told, and one of the men leaned in without realizing it, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place what he was seeing against what he had always believed, and the distance between those two things began to stretch in a way that could not be ignored. Clara stepped back then, giving the map space, giving them space, her expression unchanged, her silence more powerful than any argument she could have made, and Elias took a single step closer, not to stand over it, not to claim it, but to see it clearly, his shadow falling beside the others now, not in front, not behind. No one reached out to touch it, not at first, because something about it resisted that kind of handling, not by force, but by presence, and the man who had spoken earlier shifted again, his voice lower now, almost careful, as if he were speaking in a place that demanded respect without ever asking for it. Clara did not answer immediately. She let his words settle, let them find their place in the quiet, and when she finally spoke, it was not louder than before, not sharper, just steady, clear, carrying the kind of certainty that did not need to be repeated to be understood. The men exchanged another look, this time not uncertain, but aware, and the air in the barn seemed to tighten just slightly, as if something invisible had drawn a line none of them had seen before, and now that they had, they could not pretend it was not there. Elias lifted his gaze from the map to Clara, and there was no doubt left in it now, only recognition, the kind that changes what a man is willing to stand for. And outside, the wind shifted again, softer this time, as if the land itself had settled into the truth being laid bare inside those wooden walls. No one in that barn could unsee it now, not the way the lines curved against everything they had been told, not the way the boundary cut through the land they thought they knew. And the silence that followed was not confusion anymore. It was recognition settling in slow, heavy, unavoidable. The man closest to the table shifted his stance, one boot dragging lightly against the dirt as if he needed to feel something solid beneath him, and his eyes moved again across the map, tracing the ridge that no longer stood, the river bend that had shifted over the years, and the mark in the corner that tied it all to a time before fences, before claims had been spoken into existence by men who arrived later and louder. Clara Whitmore did not move. She let them look, let them measure what they saw against what they had believed, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her breathing steady, as if she had already walked this distance long before they had taken their first step. Elias Carter leaned slightly closer, not enough to crowd the space, just enough to see the finer details, and his eyes paused at the seal again. That faint imprint pressed into the parchment, and something about it held him there a second longer than the rest, as if it answered a question he had not asked out loud. One of the men finally reached out, his hand hovering above the edge of the map, not touching, just close enough to feel the presence of it, and he pulled back again, slow, careful, as if he understood that this was not something to be handled lightly. The man at the front cleared his throat again, but this time there was no trace of authority in the sound, only the weight of someone stepping into unfamiliar ground. And when he spoke, his voice carried less certainty, more caution, the kind that comes when a man realizes he might have been standing on the wrong side of something important. Clara listened, her gaze steady, and when she answered, she did not raise her voice, did not press her advantage. She simply spoke with the same calm clarity she had carried from the beginning, letting the truth stand on its own without dressing it in more than it needed. Outside, a loose board tapped softly against the side of the barn, the rhythm slow and irregular, like a clock that did not care about time, and inside, the air seemed to tighten just enough to make every breath more noticeable. Elias straightened then, his eyes lifting from the map to the men gathered around it. And there was something different in the way he looked at them now, not challenging, not accusing, but steady, grounded, as if he had already chosen where he stood and was simply waiting for the rest to catch up. The man at the front glanced toward him, then back at Clara, and in that small movement, something shifted, something subtle but real, the kind of change that does not announce itself but cannot be undone once it has begun. Clara reached forward then, not to close the map, not yet, but to rest her fingers lightly on one corner, anchoring it in place as if to remind them that this was not a story being told, not a claim being argued, but a truth laid out in ink and time. No one spoke for a long moment after that, because there was nothing left to question without first accepting what they were seeing, and the barn, with its quiet beams and steady light, held that silence like something sacred, something that marked the exact point where doubt gave way to understanding. Of what had been seen did not lift, it settled deeper, and the man at the front drew in a slow breath that seemed to carry more than just air, his eyes lingering on the map before lifting toward Clara Whitmore. And this time when he spoke, it was not to question but to understand, his voice lower, measured, as if each word had to pass through something heavier than pride before it could leave him. Clara did not rush to answer. She let the quiet do its work, let the truth remain where it had been placed, open and undeniable, her fingers still resting lightly against the corner of the parchment as though she were holding not just paper, but the line between what was and what would follow. Elias Carter shifted his weight slightly, the faint sound of his boot against the dirt floor grounding the moment, and his gaze moved once more across the men, reading the change in them the way a man reads the sky before a storm that has already decided not to come. One of the riders stepped closer to the table, slower this time, his shoulders no longer squared in the same way, his posture carrying the quiet recognition of someone who had arrived expecting one thing and found another, and he leaned in just enough to see the mark near the edge, the one tied to a name older than any claim spoken in town, and he exhaled softly, the sound almost lost in the stillness. Outside, the wind shifted again, brushing along the side of the barn, softer now, like something easing its hold, and inside, the light through the doorway caught the edge of the map, tracing its worn lines with a kind of quiet clarity that no voice could improve upon. The man at the front removed his hat then, not with ceremony, not for show, just a simple motion that spoke louder than anything he had said before, and he held it at his side, his eyes returning to Clara, not with challenge, but with something closer to respect. Clara met his gaze without changing her expression, her calm steady as ever, and when she finally spoke, it was not to press, not to claim victory, but to leave the truth where it stood, unadorned, complete in itself. Elias watched that exchange without interruption, his presence unchanged. But the set of his shoulders carried a quiet finality now, as if the line had been drawn and he had already chosen which side of it he would stand on, no matter who else followed. The other men shifted slightly, not away, not forward, just enough to acknowledge what had settled among them, and one by one, their attention moved from the map to Clara, then briefly to Elias, and back again, the space between them no longer defined by distance, but by understanding. The barn held that moment, held it steady and unbroken, and in that stillness, something gave way, not loudly, not with resistance, but with the quiet certainty of something that had never truly belonged where it was placed. The man at the front nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried the weight of decision, and as he turned slightly toward the others, there was no need for orders, no need for command, because the truth on that table had already spoken in a language none of them could ignore, and the only thing left now was what each of them chose to do with it. No one argued after that nod, because there was nothing left to defend without denying what lay plain on the table, and the men who had ridden in with certainty now stood in a different kind of stillness, one shaped not by doubt, but by the slow acceptance of having been wrong, and it showed in small ways, in the way one man lowered his gaze, in the way another adjusted his hat without putting it back on, in the way their boots no longer pressed into the dirt like they owned it. Exhaled slowly, then placed his hat back on his head with a care that had not been there before, and when he spoke again, it was not to question ownership, not to challenge boundaries, but to acknowledge what the map had already said, his voice carrying the weight of a man choosing to stand on truth rather than pride. One of the others nodded faintly, almost to himself, and another shifted his stance, turning slightly toward the open barn door where the light stretched across the ground outside, as if measuring the land again with new eyes. The wind moved through the doorway, lifting a corner of dust that drifted and settled without urgency, and in that quiet motion, the tension that had filled the space seemed to loosen its hold, not gone entirely, but no longer in control. Clara finally lifted her hand from the map, not to close it yet, just enough to let it lie fully open on its own, the parchment resting flat, unguarded, as if it no longer needed her to hold it steady. Elias glanced at her briefly, a small, almost unnoticeable movement, but there was understanding in it, a shared recognition that this moment had already turned, and that whatever came next would not be decided by force or raised voices, but by what each man chose to carry with him when he walked away. The man at the front stepped back half a pace, giving the table more space than before, and the others followed in quiet agreement, their movements unspoken but aligned, and no one reached for the map again. No one tried to fold it or claim it, because it had already done what it came to do. Outside, a horse shifted and let out a low breath, the sound drifting in through the open door, grounding the moment in something simple and real, and inside, the barn stood as it always had, wood and dust and light, but the space within it had changed, shaped now by a truth that had been seen, and, more importantly, accepted. Clara drew a slow breath, her gaze moving once across the men, not searching, not judging, just steady, and then she let it settle again, knowing without needing to hear it spoken that the line drawn on that map would hold, not because it was enforced, but because it had been understood. And in that understanding, something quieter and stronger than conflict had taken its place. The men did not leave all at once. They drifted out of the barn in ones and twos, slow and thoughtful, like a tide pulling back without force, and each step they took seemed lighter than the one before, as if something unseen had been set down behind them. The man who had stood at the front paused at the doorway, his hand resting briefly against the worn wood of the frame, and he looked back once, not at the map this time, but at Clara Whitmore, his gaze steady and quiet, holding a kind of acknowledgement that did not need words, and then he stepped out into the light. The others followed, boots pressing into the sunlit dirt, hats settling back onto heads, shoulders no longer squared for a fight that had never come, and the sound of their horses shifting carried a different tone now, calmer, unhurried, as if even the animals felt the change that had passed through the space. Inside the barn, the air remained still for a long moment after the last man left, holding the echo of what had been decided without voices raised or hands forced. And Clara stood where she had been, her eyes resting on the open doorway, watching the last trace of movement fade into the wide stretch of land beyond. Elias Carter let out a quiet breath, almost imperceptible, and reached forward to adjust the edge of the map, smoothing it flat against the table with a careful motion, not out of necessity, but out of respect for what it had carried into that room. Clara stepped closer then, her boots soft against the dirt floor, and she placed her hand beside his, not touching, just near enough to share the space, her gaze lowering to the lines that had drawn more than borders, that had drawn a truth others had nearly forgotten. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to explain, and in that silence, something deeper than victory settled between them, something quieter and more enduring. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie, brushing through dry grass and carrying with it the faint scent of earth and distance, and it slipped through the open barn door like a reminder that the land had always been here, unchanged by the arguments of men. Elias straightened slowly, his eyes lifting to the horizon beyond the doorway, and there was a steadiness in him that did not come from winning, but from standing where he knew he should, and Clara followed his gaze, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, as if she had always belonged exactly where she stood. She reached then for the map, not to hide it, but to fold it with care, each crease aligned with the others, her fingers moving with a familiarity that spoke of time spent with it, of understanding that went beyond ink and paper. When she finished, she held it for a moment, the folded parchment resting lightly in her hands, and then she set it aside on the table, not locked away, not hidden, just placed where it could be found again if needed. The barn, now empty of all but the two of them, seemed larger in the quiet, the beams stretching above, the lights settling into corners that had been filled with tension only moments before, and in that space, the absence of conflict felt more powerful than any resolution spoken aloud. Elias glanced at Clara once more, a small, knowing look, and she met it without hesitation, her eyes clear, steady, and then they both turned toward the open door, toward the land that had just been given back its truth, and without another word, they stepped forward into the light, leaving behind a room that would remember, even if no one ever spoke of it again. The sun had begun its slow descent when they stepped out onto the open stretch, casting long shadows that moved quietly across the land as if they had always known where to fall, and Clara Whitmore paused just beyond the threshold, her eyes sweeping the horizon not to claim it, not to measure it, but simply to see it as it was, wide and unbroken and honest in a way that no argument could ever change. Elias Carter stood a few feet beside her, his posture relaxed but steady, the brim of his worn hat catching the light just enough to cast a shadow across his eyes, and for a moment, neither of them moved, because the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something earned, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. In the distance, the riders were already becoming smaller against the open land, their shapes blending into the dust and light, not fleeing, not retreating, just leaving with a different weight than the one they had carried in, and that difference lingered in the air long after they were gone. Clara reached up and adjusted the collar of her blouse, a small, habitual motion, and her fingers brushed briefly against the silver star at her neck, the metal catching a faint glint of sunlight before settling again. And there was something in that gesture that spoke of continuity, of a life that would move forward not defined by what had happened, but strengthened by it. Elias glanced toward her, then out across the land, and the faintest trace of a nod passed between them, not agreement, not acknowledgement of victory, but something quieter, something closer to recognition, as if they both understood that what had taken place inside that barn would not echo in loud stories or proud retellings, but would remain where it belonged, in the quiet choices that followed. A breeze moved through the grass, low and steady, carrying with it the scent of earth warmed by the sun and the distant promise of evening, and it passed between them without resistance, lifting a strand of Clara's hair before letting it fall again, soft and unforced, like everything else that had settled into place. She took a step forward then, her boots pressing lightly into the ground, and Elias followed without hesitation, their movements unhurried, aligned not by command but by understanding, and together they walked along the edge of the land that had just been given back its truth, not marked by fences or signs, but by something deeper, something that would not shift with the next voice raised or the next claim made. Behind them, the barn stood quiet and unchanged, its weathered boards holding the memory of what had passed within, not as a place of conflict, but as a place where something had been set right without force, without spectacle, and without a single shot fired. The sky above stretched wide and clear, the kind of sky that did not belong to anyone, and yet held space for everyone. And as the light softened and the shadows lengthened, the land seemed to settle into itself, as if acknowledging what had always been true beneath the noise of men. Clara slowed for a moment, her gaze drifting once more across the horizon, and there was no triumph in her expression, no need to hold on to the moment, only a quiet steadiness that came from knowing she had stood where she needed to stand, and had not stepped away. Elias stopped beside her, his presence calm and grounded, and for a brief second, they simply stood there, looking out at the same stretch of earth, sharing the same silence, and in that stillness, there was a kind of justice that did not need a name. Then, without a word, they continued forward, their figures moving into the open land as the day gave way to evening, leaving behind nothing but a quiet truth, the kind that does not demand to be remembered, because it never needed to be forgotten. In this deeply moving tale of Western stories, a quiet frontier ranch woman walks into a town that has already judged her, only to face a seasoned sheriff whose laughter echoes louder than truth. Yet beneath the dust and silence, something far older waits to be revealed. As the tension builds in this unforgettable piece of Western stories, a lone cowboy with a weathered past stands beside her, not as a savior but as a witness to something greater, while a simple map becomes the center of doubt, pride, and quiet reckoning. Through slow-burning moments and unspoken stares, this story captures the essence of Western stories where justice is not taken but understood, where every glance and every step carries the weight of history. As the town's certainty begins to crack, the ranch woman holds her ground with calm dignity, and the cowboy's silent presence steadies the shifting tide, revealing that truth does not shout, it waits. This cinematic journey through Western stories delivers a powerful message about prejudice, honor, and the kind of courage that does not draw a gun, but stands still when it matters most. In the end, as the dust settles and the land speaks for itself, this final reflection on Western stories reminds us that real justice does not arrive with noise, but with quiet understanding, leaving behind a silence that says everything.